Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we tiptoe back in time, past the flickering gas lamps and creaking floorboards, to a place where a kingdom's fate hung by a gossamer thread, a single agonising breath. Imagine yourself there, a silent observer in a grand, suffocatingly gilded room in Madrid. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and fear. Outside, the night is inky black, but here, inside the Royal Alcazar, a drama is unfolding that will echo across continents for centuries to come. A queen, worn thin by labour, is giving birth. But this isn't a moment of joyous expectation, it's one of dread. You're standing so close you can almost feel the collective anxiety radiating from the doctors and priests. Their faces grim, their prayers a desperate hum. They know, as do you, that the child being born is more than a future king. He is the last flickering candle in a magnificent yet terribly fragile dynasty. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, for what you're about to witness is a history so bleak, so shot through with suffering and ill fortune, that it might just haunt your dreams. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're up for it, leave a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far our little history club reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the royal chambers on November 6th, 1661. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, is in the final brutal throes of labour. Her husband, King Philip IV, paces the antechamber, a ghost of a man weighed down by the burden of his failing health and the desperate need for a male heir. He has had children before, but they have a tendency to die. His only surviving son from his first marriage, Balthazar Charles, died at 16. His other sons from Mariana have also perished in infancy. This child, this new life struggling to enter the world, represents his final hope, the very survival of the Spanish Habsburg line, the dynasty that once commanded an empire on which the sun never sets, now teeters on the brink, and its fate lies in the hands of this unborn child. The cry, when it finally comes, is weak and raspy. The doctors exchange a look that tells a story all its own. They present the infant to the Queen, and a collective gasp ripples through the room. Even in the dim light of the candles, the deformities are unmistakable. His head is abnormally large, his body slight and frail. His most striking feature, however, is the infamous Habsburg jaw, a prognathism so severe that his lower jaw juts out grotesquely, making it impossible for his teeth to meet properly. His tongue is so large it droops from his mouth, causing him to drool perpetually and speak with a near unintelligible lisp. They name him Charles, in a grim echo of his illustrious ancestor Charles V. But this child is no warrior emperor. He's a testament to the terrible price of power and purity. Historians still argue whether his mother, Mariana, was truly shocked, or if she had resigned herself to this fate. She herself was the product of a Habsburg union, marrying her own uncle. She would have been all too familiar with the family's predisposition for physical and mental decay. For the next 4 years, Charles remains a fragile, silent child. He's unable to walk until he is 4 and barely speaks until he is 5. The court physicians, a group of men who operate more on superstition than science, fuss over him, administering bizarre remedies and concoctions. They wrap him in swaddling clothes so tight he can barely move, a practice thought to straighten weak limbs, but which in his case likely stunted his development further. His every illness, every fever, is met with an outpouring of prayer and a fresh dose of some foul-smelling herbal potion. The expectation of his death is so constant that he is baptized with a special rite called a baptism of necessity that is normally reserved for infants not expected to survive. This mainstream historical fact, that the future king was not expected to live through infancy, underscores the fragility of the dynasty. You watch as the boy is coddled and isolated, shielded from the harsh realities of the outside world, not out of love so much as a kind of morbid preservation. His existence is a political statement. The French king, Louis XIV, is already circling, his hungry eyes fixed on the vast Spanish territories. As long as Charles lives, however feebly, the French cannot make a direct claim. This makes Charles a living, breathing symbol of Spanish sovereignty, even as his own body betrays him. It's a bit like buying the most fragile piece of antique china you've ever seen, and then setting it on a rickety shelf in an earthquake zone. Everyone knows it's going to break eventually, but you just can't bear to move it. The unique fringe tidbit you pick up on is the peculiar custom surrounding his health. When Charles was born, it was believed that his survival was directly tied to the relics of Saint Isidore, a patron saint of Madrid. The priests would bring the relics from their church to the palace, parading them through the streets in solemn procession whenever the infant prince suffered from a fever. It was a bizarre blend of religious devotion and folk belief, all centred on this tiny, sickly boy. They weren't just praying for his health, they were literally bringing a dead saint to his bedside. The irony, of course, is that the very people who so desperately sought his survival were the ones who had unwittingly created his suffering. His mother and father were uncle and niece. His grandmother was also his great-aunt. The family tree was less a tree and more of a tangled, self-referential vine. Each generation married closer and closer to the last, desperately trying to keep the bloodline pure. But they were only concentrating their weaknesses, ensuring that the next generation would be a magnified version of the last. And so we arrive at Charles, a biological dead end, a walking, breathing monument to a fatal genetic experiment. He is, to put it gently, the ultimate product of a dynasty that ate itself. He's born to rule, but his body and mind were already failing him from the moment he entered the world. His life is a tragedy of cosmic proportions, a quiet, slow-motion disaster that will eventually plunge all of Europe into a bloody decades-long war. The stage is set, the players are in place, and you, my sleepless friend, have a front-row seat. You can see the boy now, wrapped in his swaddling clothes, his tiny, malformed hands twitching. He is the king who will give birth to a monster, but the real monster, you're beginning to understand, is the dynasty itself. You're still there, a silent observer in the gilded corridors of the Royal Alcazar, and you're starting to see the invisible threads of history that weave this tragedy. To truly understand Charles II, you must first understand the family that created him. It's a story of ambition, power, and a spectacular failure to grasp basic biology. His story isn't just about him, it's about the Habsburgs, the most powerful dynasty in Europe for centuries, who believed their blood was so special it shouldn't be mixed with anyone else's. It's a bit like a baker who keeps using the same sourdough starter for 1,000 years, never adding fresh flour until the bread gets a little funky. The tale begins much earlier, back in the 16th century with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He was a man of immense power, and his dynasty, the Habsburgs, ruled over Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. His motto was plus ultra, or further beyond, and he meant it. He wanted his family's power to be perpetual, and to ensure that his children and grandchildren began marrying each other. It sounds wild, I know, but for them, it was the most logical thing in the world. Royal blood was seen as something sacred, a divine gift, and they couldn't risk tainting it with the common clay of other noble houses. So they kept it all in the family, creating a human genetic closed-loop system. Let's quickly trace the line of Charles II's parents to see just how tangled this family tree was. His father, Philip IV of Spain, and his mother, Mariana of Austria, were not just a king and queen, they were uncle and niece. Mariana's father, Ferdinand III, was Philip IV's brother-in-law. Her mother, Maria Anna, was Philip IV's sister. Still with me? It gets worse. Charles's paternal grandmother was also his maternal great-aunt, and his paternal grandfather was his great-uncle. If you were to draw this out on a family tree, it wouldn't look like a tree at all. It would look like a complicated macrame project that's gone terribly, terribly wrong. This mainstream historical fact is the key to understanding everything that follows. The Habsburgs were masters of political manoeuvring, but they were utter failures at genetic preservation. The result of all this inbreeding was a series of physical characteristics that became hallmarks of the dynasty. The most famous, of course, is the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism. This wasn't a sudden, one-off mutation. It was a trait that became more and more pronounced with each generation of cousin marriages. Portraits of earlier Habsburgs show a slight jut to the chin, but by the time you get to Philip IV, it's quite noticeable. With Charles II, it becomes a severe deformity. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet, making chewing a challenge and his speech a garbled mess. He couldn't even close his mouth properly, which is a big part of why he drooled all the time. It's a physical manifestation of the dynasty's arrogance, a visible, tragic billboard of their genetic folly. It's a bit like a car manufacturer who keeps building a car with a faulty engine, and with each new model the engine gets a little bit worse, until eventually the car just doesn't work. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that this jaw wasn't just a physical issue, it was a psychological one. The Habsburgs were incredibly vain about their appearance and their royal dignity. A king's image was paramount, a symbol of divine right. So, when Philip IV sat for his portraits, the court painters, like Velázquez, had to find creative ways to downplay the severity of the prognathism, often showing him in profile or with his mouth partially obscured. They couldn't just airbrush it out. That would have been sacrilege, so they used artistic tricks. For Charles II, the problem was so bad that portraiture became a painful affair. The artist had to capture the king's likeness, but also had to preserve his dignity, which was a nearly impossible task. The result is that many of his portraits are slightly idealised, trying to soften the tragic reality of his face. Historians still argue whether this physical decay was the sole cause of the Habsburgs' downfall, or merely a symptom of a larger systemic failure. Was Charles's reign doomed from birth because of his physical and mental limitations? Or were the political and economic crises of Spain simply too much for any monarch to handle? The answer, as with most things in history, is probably a bit of both. The genetic time bomb was ticking, but the kingdom was also facing external pressures from the rising power of France and the economic fallout of endless wars. Charles was the perfect storm, a sickly vessel sailing a ship of state already battered by a tempest. You can almost hear the court whisperers, the people who saw this coming 100 years ago. They knew that the purity of the bloodline was a myth. They must have seen the children of these close unions, the ones who were born sickly, deformed, or who died in infancy. The statistics were staggering. In the 17th century, a high infant mortality rate was common, but the Habsburgs' numbers were off the charts. Of Philip IV and Mariana's 6 children, only 2 survived infancy, Charles and his older sister, Margaret Theresa. Think about that for a moment. Only 2 out of 6. The rest were born and died so quickly that they barely registered on the historical timeline. It was a macabre cycle of hope and despair, each birth a desperate roll of the genetic dice, and each death a quiet confirmation that the house of cards was falling. This insidious curse wasn't just physical. The mental and intellectual toll was also significant. Later accounts of Charles II describe a man who was childlike, easily led, and prone to irrational fears and emotional outbursts. He was described as a king with the mind of a 6-year-old. His inability to reason clearly, to hold a coherent thought, would make him an easy target for the various court factions that would later seek to control him. He was a king in name only, a puppet whose strings were pulled by ambitious courtiers, opportunistic priests, and foreign powers who saw in his weakness an opportunity for their own gain. The Habsburgs, in their desperate quest for purity, had instead created the ultimate political and biological liability. They had produced a king who was a physical manifestation of their family's decay, a living, breathing testament to the dangers of hubris, and a warning to any dynasty that believes itself above the natural laws of the world. You're watching the unravelling of a dynasty, and the man at the centre of it all is a boy who will be born old, a king who will be crowned a ghost. The air in the Alcazar is still and heavy, and you find yourself following the tiny, frail form of Prince Charles. You see him not as a future king, but as a small boy trapped in a golden cage, a symbol of a dynasty's decay. His early childhood is less about learning to rule and more about simply existing. He's a child born with a body and a mind that are actively working against him. His limbs are weak and spindly. His large, misshapen head seems to be a burden he can barely support. He's unable to walk on his own until the age of 4, a full 2 years after most children. His speech is an agonizing struggle, a series of guttural sounds and slobbering consonants, making it nearly impossible for anyone outside his immediate circle to understand him. It's the kind of thing that would, in another context, be heartbreaking. But here, in the cold, transactional world of the Spanish court, it's just another problem to be managed. His mother, Mariana of Austria, is the primary figure in his life. She's now the Queen Regent, as his father, Philip IV, died when Charles was 4. You can see her now, a woman of sharp intelligence and a deep sense of piety, but also one who is fiercely protective and perhaps a little too aware of her own precarious position. She had to navigate a court filled with ambitious men who saw the young king as a puppet to be controlled. Her solution was to keep him close, isolated, and under her watchful eye. He was a pawn, but for her he was also the key to her own power. She loved him, in her own way, but her love was intertwined with political necessity. This is a mainstream historical fact. Charles's childhood was defined by his mother's regency and her efforts to maintain control over the court. He is educated, of course, but it's a shambles. The court, in a bizarre blend of superstition and a genuine desire to protect his fragile health, believed that excessive study would be too taxing for his mind. So his formal education is minimal. He learns to read and write, but only just. He is taught some Latin and a smattering of history, but the tutors are constantly warned not to overtax him. He spends his days in the care of servants and nannies, more like a precious, breakable ornament than a future head of state. There are no other children his age to play with, no boisterous games of hide-and-seek in the palace gardens. His world is one of hushed tones, worried glances, and endless prayers for his health. This isn't a childhood. It's a long, drawn-out convalescence. It's like being given a brand new, incredibly expensive bicycle, but being told you're not allowed to ride it because it might get a scratch. The quirky or fringe tidbit here lies in the very specific and bizarre treatments prescribed by his physicians. They believed that his physical weakness was a result of excessive humours, a medieval medical theory that persisted long into the 17th century. To correct this imbalance, they subjected the young king to repeated rounds of bloodletting and blistering. They would apply heated cups to his skin to draw out blood, and place irritant salves on him to create blisters, all in the misguided belief that they were purging his body of what was making him sick. For a child who was already frail and anemic, this was likely more harmful than helpful. You can almost feel the young boy's terror as these men, in their sombre black robes, would descend on him with their lances and their pots of strange potions. It's a testament to the era's medical ignorance, and it further illustrates his isolation. He was not seen as a child in need of care, but as a scientific curiosity, a problem to be solved with medieval brutality. Historians still argue whether his mental deficiencies were a direct result of his genetic condition, or if they were exacerbated by his secluded, intellectually stunted upbringing. Was he born with a limited intellect, or did a lack of stimulation and a paranoid, overprotective mother prevent him from developing? It's a classic nature versus nurture debate, but in Charles's case, both seem to be working in grim harmony. His inbreeding gave him a foundation of weakness, and his childhood environment did nothing to help him build on it. He was a vessel that was never filled, an engine that was never started. He was, in essence, a king-shaped hole where a king should have been. You get a sense of the political undercurrent swirling around this fragile boy. Spain is hemorrhaging money and territory, and the great powers of Europe, specifically France under the formidable Louis XIV, are watching, waiting for the inevitable. The young king is not a source of strength. He is a source of anxiety. Every sniffle, every fever sends a wave of panic through the court. The news of his sickness spreads through Europe like wildfire, and every foreign diplomat holds his breath, wondering if this is the moment. It's like watching a Jenga tower, already leaning precariously, and seeing someone try to add another block to the very top. You just know it's going to come crashing down. The Queen Regent, Mariana, is doing her best to hold the pieces together, but she's a woman fighting a war on two fronts, one against the political machinations of the court, and another against the biological breakdown of her own son. One of the lighter, if still a little dark, jokes of the time came from the French court, which was famous for its wit and its cruelty. They called Charles El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because his illnesses and deformities were so severe that they were believed to be the result of a sorcerer's curse. It was a vicious, mocking nickname that perfectly summed up the French attitude toward Spain's weakness. A curse, they thought, was more likely than the simple, terrible truth that his family had done this to itself. The name stuck, and it would follow Charles for the rest of his life, a cruel reminder of how the rest of Europe saw him, not as a king, but as an object of pity and derision, a living ghost haunting the throne of Spain. You're seeing it all now, the isolated child, the panicked mother, the scheming courtiers, all swirling around a tiny sickly boy who will grow up to be a man but never truly a king. His childhood, you realise, was a premonition of his reign, a long, slow decline. The year is 1665. You're still a spectral presence in the royal Alcazar, watching as the sickly King Philip IV finally succumbs to his own ailments, a man weary from the pressures of a failing kingdom and a failing body. He's just 59 years old, but looks decades older. His death is not a surprise, but it is a cataclysm. With his last breath, the vast Spanish Empire falls into the hands of his 4-year-old son, the one you have watched struggling to even stand on his own 2 feet. The boy king, Charles II, is a physical manifestation of his inheritance, fragile, burdened, and on the brink of collapse. The crown, a heavy, magnificent thing, is placed on his large, misshapen head, and he is declared a king of Spain, Naples, Sicily, the Spanish Netherlands, and all the Spanish colonies in the Americas and Asia. A mainstream historical fact is that this coronation, though a formality, was met with a mixture of reverence and abject terror. The boy, who could not speak a coherent sentence or close his mouth, was now the most powerful monarch in the world. Because Charles is a child, the real power immediately falls to a regency council. The most influential figure, as you've already seen, is his mother, Queen Mariana of Austria. She's a woman of immense piety, rigid morals, and a desperate desire to protect her son and her own position. She's officially named Queen Regent, and for the next decade she will be the de facto ruler of Spain. You watch her navigate the treacherous currents of the court. She has to contend with a series of powerful, ambitious men who are all too happy to take advantage of the situation. There's Juan José of Austria, an illegitimate but hugely popular son of Philip IV, and thus Charles's half-brother. He is a charismatic military leader and a potential rival for power. Mariana, correctly seeing him as a threat, does everything she can to marginalise him, exiling him from court and appointing her own loyalists to key positions. It's a bizarre setup. The kingdom is governed by a woman who is acting in the name of a child who can barely understand what is happening around him. He is the ultimate figurehead, a silent, drooling puppet whose every action is controlled by others. His days are still a monotonous cycle of prayer, minimal schooling, and the endless ministrations of doctors. He is still kept in a state of semi-isolation, a protective bubble that serves his mother's political interests as much as it does his health. It's a cruel kind of irony. The King of Spain, who theoretically commands millions of subjects, is himself a captive in his own palace. He's a bit like a rare, endangered flower that everyone wants to protect, but nobody wants to actually look at, let alone touch. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the almost total lack of public-facing appearances for the young king. The court went to great lengths to hide his deformities from the public. While portraits of him were painted, they were heavily idealised, a careful balancing act between presenting the king as he was and presenting the king as he should have been. For example, the famous portrait by Juan Carreño de Miranda shows Charles in a magnificent velvet suit, looking regal and dignified. But if you look closely, you can still see the telltale signs: the large head, the vacant expression, the slight jut of the chin. It's an illusion, a beautiful lie meant to reassure the public that their king was whole. The few times he was required to appear in public for a procession or a ceremony, he would be heavily supervised and almost physically propped up, his movements slow and his face a mask of bewilderment. This reliance on visual misdirection raises a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Spanish public was truly ignorant of their king's condition, or if they were playing along with the illusion. Did they truly believe the official story that their king was merely delicate, or did they all know, on some unspoken level, that they were being ruled by a profoundly unwell boy? Was it a conscious deception on the part of the court, or was it a collective act of denial on the part of the entire kingdom? The vastness of the Spanish Empire meant that a great many people had never seen their king, so the myth was easier to maintain. But for those in Madrid, the reality must have been hard to ignore. The Regency is not without its dramatic moments. The court splits into factions, each vying for influence. The Austrian party, led by Queen Mariana, favours her Habsburg relatives. The French party, though small, sees an alliance with Louis XIV as the only way forward. And then there is the Spanish party, who rally around Juan José of Austria, the king's dashing half-brother. It's a powder keg, and the boy king is the fuse. He is the justification for every move, every plot, every power grab. The Queen Regent would often bring Charles, still a small fragile child, to council meetings, sitting him on a throne and having him nod along as she made decisions in his name. It was an almost theatrical display of power, a constant reminder that she, and she alone, spoke for the sovereign. It's a little like watching a really intense game of chess where one player is using a tiny sleepy cat as their king piece. The years of the regency drag on, and the kingdom slides further into decline. The economy is in tatters, the silver from the Americas is dwindling, and the army is losing battles across Europe. The Spanish Empire is starting to show its age, its seams fraying, its glory fading. And all the while, the boy king, Charles, grows older, but not necessarily stronger. His physical and mental development are stunted. He remains a child in many ways, with a child's simple emotions and a child's limited understanding of the world. By the time he officially comes of age and the regency ends, he is still not capable of ruling. He is 19 years old but seems far younger. The transition from a regent to a king is, in this case, not a transfer of power, but a continuation of the same power structure, with the same people pulling the same strings, only now with the pretense of a fully fledged monarch at the helm. And you can see the sad irony of it all. The kingdom finally has its king, and he's not even there. You're still there, a ghost in the hallowed halls, watching as the boy king, now a young man in his late teens, takes on the full weight of his title. The regency is officially over, and Charles II is meant to rule in his own right. But the reality is far from the fantasy. He's 19 years old, but his mind is still a foggy, uncertain place. The Habsburg jaw makes his speech a garbled mess, and the perpetual drool is a constant, humiliating presence. He is, by all accounts, a profoundly lonely and simple man, easily influenced and prone to outbursts of rage and frustration. The court, a pit of vipers, knows this, and is all too eager to exploit it. The biggest problem now, a problem that has haunted his family for decades, is the need for an heir. The Spanish Habsburg line is hanging by a single, fraying thread, and that thread is Charles. To secure the dynasty, a marriage is arranged. The chosen bride is Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, a niece of none other than Charles's great nemesis, Louis XIV. The marriage is not one of love, but a calculated political manoeuvre. It's an attempt to create an alliance, to soften the French king's aggressive stance towards Spain, and most importantly to produce a son. Marie-Louise is a woman of grace and wit, a product of the sophisticated French court. She's beautiful, intelligent and vivacious. The contrast between her and the king she is to marry could not be more stark. It's a mainstream historical fact that this marriage was a union of a sophisticated French princess and a deeply troubled, sickly Spanish king, a pairing that was from the start a recipe for tragedy. Marie-Louise arrives in Madrid to a city in a state of decay. The Spanish court, once the most magnificent in Europe, is now austere and filled with a suffocating, pious solemnity. She finds the palace a gloomy, cold place, a far cry from the glittering brilliance of Versailles. But the greatest shock, of course, is her husband. The first time she sees him, she's said to have been so taken aback by his appearance that she fainted. It's a tragic moment you can almost feel, the weight of her destiny, the crushing reality of who she must marry, all hitting her at once. She's a woman who has been groomed her whole life for a royal marriage, but nothing could have prepared her for this. He is a king, yes, but he is also a profoundly sick man, a walking testament to a family's fatal flaw. It's a bit like buying a beautiful, intricate cuckoo clock and then discovering that the cuckoo is a little unhinged. The early years of the marriage are a public performance of desperate hope. The court is buzzing with expectation. The people pray for a child. The doctors are in constant attendance, offering advice and strange concoctions. But behind the closed doors of the royal apartments, the marriage is a sad, sterile affair. Charles, due to his physical and mental state, is not well equipped to be a husband, let alone a father. His health, always precarious, is now further strained by the pressure to consummate the marriage. Marie-Louise, who was a lively, energetic woman, soon becomes withdrawn and melancholic. She tries her best to be a good wife, but the emotional and physical gulf between them is vast. She writes to her friends in France, describing her life as a kind of living death. A gilded prison where she is constantly under observation, judged for her every move, and burdened with an impossible task. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the intense public scrutiny of her every move, particularly when it came to her diet and her body. The court, in its desperation, believed that her French diet of rich sauces and elaborate pastries was somehow interfering with her ability to conceive. They forced her to adopt the much more austere Spanish diet, which was heavy on bland boiled meats and simple vegetables. They believed that this new diet would make her more fertile. Imagine being a queen, burdened with an impossible task, and then being told that the very food you eat is a national concern. It's a hilarious and deeply sad example of a court grasping at straws, desperately trying to find a magical solution to a problem that was, for all intents and purposes, unsolvable. The king, after all, was the problem, but no one dared to say it out loud. Historians still argue whether Marie-Louise was ever truly able to conceive, or if her failure was entirely due to Charles's infertility. We know now from later evidence that Charles was almost certainly infertile, but at the time the blame, both public and private, was laid squarely on her. She was a foreign queen, a French woman, a daughter of their great enemy. The whisperers at court, the ones who saw her as a threat to their own power, were all too happy to blame her for the lack of an heir. She was painted as a barren, frivolous foreigner, a woman who cared more for her dogs and her horses than for the fate of Spain. The pressure on her was immense, a constant suffocating cloud of expectation and disappointment. As the years pass and no child appears, the hope of the court slowly curdles into suspicion. The whispers grow louder, conspiracies begin to form. The French king, Louis XIV, who had once been a keen supporter of the marriage, now begins to see it as an opportunity. A child from this union would be French by blood, and thus a potential puppet for his own ambitions. The failure to produce an heir only deepens the crisis, making the Spanish succession a topic of fierce debate across all the royal courts of Europe. It's a bit like watching a clock count down to zero, and everyone in the room knows what's coming, but no one wants to be the first to look away. Marie-Louise, the beautiful, tragic queen, is now at the centre of a storm she never asked for, a pawn in a game that will eventually consume not just her life, but the entire continent. You can see her now, a figure of profound sadness, wandering the gloomy halls of the Alcazar, a woman whose entire purpose was to have a child she would never be able to have. The years pass like silent, creeping shadows within the Alcazar. You're watching the quiet tragedy of Queen Marie-Louise unfold. She arrived a vivacious, hopeful young woman, but the crushing weight of her role has turned her into a ghost. The court, once so hopeful for a new life, now watches her with cold, calculating eyes. The problem is a simple one, and it's the one everyone is praying about, whispering about, and plotting over. There is no child. A mainstream historical fact is that Marie-Louise of Orléans endured 9 years of marriage without producing a single heir, a failure that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Her barrenness became a political weapon, a source of endless gossip and vicious cruelty. The court is a strange place, a hothouse of intrigue where every physical symptom is seen as a sign from God, a curse, or a political omen. When Marie-Louise starts to gain weight, the whispers begin immediately. She is pregnant. But the weight gain is not a sign of new life. It's a symptom of her deep depression and the stress of her situation. When she has a sudden illness, the whispers change. She must be having a miscarriage. But there is no miscarriage because there was no pregnancy. The constant cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment takes a heavy toll on her. You see her withdrawing from court life, spending her days riding horses, a passion from her youth, or in quiet contemplation. She's an object of pity, a source of scandal, and a focal point for a kingdom's anxieties. It's a bit like being a contestant on a reality TV show, but the prize is the survival of an empire and the judges are a bunch of whispering courtiers who hate your guts. The political factions at court, seeing her inability to conceive as an opportunity, begin to spread vicious rumours. The pro-Austrian faction, loyal to Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, sees Marie-Louise as an enemy, a French interloper. They suggest she is deliberately not conceiving, that she's a puppet of her uncle Louis XIV, and that she's poisoning the king to weaken him. There's a bizarre and cruel narrative that she drinks copious amounts of chocolate, and that this decadent foreign drink is somehow making her sterile. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the intense focus on chocolate. At the time, chocolate was a new and exotic import, still viewed with a degree of suspicion and fascination. The fact that the French queen enjoyed it became a point of contention, a symbol of her foreignness and a flimsy excuse for a much larger, more tragic problem. It's a hilarious and deeply sad example of a kingdom's desperation, as if a simple change in diet could solve a deep-seated genetic problem. The tragedy of Marie-Louise is that she was utterly powerless. Her only job was to give birth to a son, and she could not. Charles, for his part, was a man trapped in his own body, likely unable to fully consummate the marriage and utterly ignorant of the political machinations swirling around him. He loves his wife in his own way, a childlike possessive affection. He finds her beautiful and is often distraught when she is ill or sad. But his love is not enough. The pressures of the court and the weight of the succession crisis are too great for a man with the emotional maturity of a child. He lashes out in frustration, his anger directed at a world he cannot comprehend. You can see him, a man-child king pacing his rooms, his large jaw jutting out, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and rage. This barrenness, this gaping hole in the succession, is what opens the door for the great powers of Europe to begin carving up the Spanish Empire. The French and Austrian factions at court are not just fighting over influence, they are fighting over the future of the continent. Louis XIV, Charles's uncle and a man with a ravenous appetite for territory, sees his niece's failure to conceive as a golden opportunity. If Charles dies without an heir, the Spanish throne could pass to Louis's own family, the Bourbons. Conversely, Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, wants the throne to pass to her own Austrian Habsburg relatives. The entire continent is watching, and you can almost feel the tension building. Historians still argue whether Marie-Louise's barrenness was a genuine medical condition, or a product of the king's own infertility, or both. But regardless of the cause, the effect was the same. The lack of an heir from this marriage was the key that unlocked the Pandora's box of the Spanish succession. The end for Marie-Louise is as tragic as her life. In 1689, 9 years into her marriage, she is suddenly taken ill after a horseback ride. The sickness is violent and quick. She dies within a week. The official cause is listed as peritonitis, but the whispers at court tell a different story. The French ambassador, in a letter, suggests she was poisoned by the anti-French faction at court. The theory, a mainstream historical fact, is that they feared her influence and wanted her gone to pave the way for a new, pro-Austrian queen. It's a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of court politics that the very people who were supposed to be her allies could have been her murderers. Her death leaves Charles bereft, a lonely, confused widower. He's truly alone now, his one source of comfort gone, and the clock on the succession crisis is ticking faster than ever. You see him, a man in a black mourning suit, walking through the corridors of the Alcazar, a tragic figure, a king who has lost everything and has nothing left to give. His barren marriage was not just a personal tragedy, it was a prelude to the continent's destruction, and you have a front-row seat. The death of Marie-Louise leaves a void in the court and in Charles's life, but the political machine of the Spanish monarchy cannot afford a moment of mourning. You watch as the machinery whirs to life again, the cogs of succession and dynasty grinding relentlessly forward. The most pressing issue is still the same, the lack of an heir. Charles is now a widower, but he's still the king, and he is still the last of his line. His health, always fragile, is in a state of constant decline, and the court knows that time is not on their side. A mainstream historical fact is that the search for a new queen began almost immediately after Marie-Louise's death, a desperate attempt to find a woman who could accomplish what the last queen could not, produce a son. But the problem isn't the queen. The problem is the king. Charles's health, both physical and mental, is now a matter of public debate and medical scrutiny. He suffers from a litany of ailments, repeated convulsions, a constant battle with fevers, and the progressive decay of his mental faculties. His doctors, a collection of men operating on a mix of medieval superstition and the nascent science of the era, are at a loss. They are desperate, and their desperation leads to some truly bizarre and frankly horrifying medical treatments. You can almost feel the young king's terror as these men, in their sombre black robes, descend upon him with their strange tools and stranger remedies. They are not healers, they are experimentalists. The primary belief, a continuation of the same theories from his childhood, is that his ailments are caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To correct this imbalance, they prescribe a series of increasingly brutal and ineffective treatments. They subject him to repeated purges, believing that they need to flush the bad humours from his system. These purges involve a variety of powerful laxatives and emetics, forcing him to vomit and endure extreme bouts of diarrhea. It's a torturous process that only serves to further weaken his already frail body, leaving him dehydrated and exhausted. He is a king, and yet he is subjected to the kind of medical torture that would make a modern person blanch. It's a bit like trying to fix a faulty engine by just hitting it with a bigger and bigger hammer, hoping something will eventually give. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the doctor's peculiar obsession with his vital spirits. They believed that Charles's life force was waning, and that they needed to replenish it. Their solution was to have him inhale the fumes from a bizarre concoction of herbs, animal parts, and other substances. They would burn these mixtures in a brazier in his room and force him to breathe in the smoke, believing that these essences would somehow restore his health. It's a tragic and almost comical attempt to find a magical solution to a problem that was purely genetic. He is a king being subjected to a kind of pre-scientific fumigation, a desperate attempt to breathe life into a man who was, from the moment of his birth, destined to die young. His mental state is also a major concern. He suffers from what we would now call psychotic episodes. He sees visions and hears voices, and he becomes convinced that he is possessed by a demon. This belief, in a deeply religious and superstitious court, is not dismissed out of hand. The court's answer is not a psychiatrist, but an exorcist. A team of priests and theologians is brought in to perform a series of elaborate exorcisms. They would pray over him, read from sacred texts, and command the demon to leave his body. Charles, a man with the intellectual and emotional maturity of a child, believes this completely. He is terrified, convinced that there is an evil entity living inside him, and the court's cure only serves to deepen his paranoia and fear. You can almost hear his frightened whispers, his voice a slurred mess, as he begs the priest to cast out the evil spirit that is tormenting him. It's a devastatingly sad image, a king reduced to a quivering, frightened child. Historians still argue whether the medical treatments and the exorcisms did more harm than good. Did the purges and fumigation further weaken his body, hastening his death? Did the exorcisms deepen his mental instability and paranoia? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. His doctors were trying to help, but their lack of understanding of his condition meant that their cures were likely more damaging than the disease itself. They were operating in the dark, and their patient was the most powerful man in the world, which only made their job more difficult and their failures more pronounced. Amidst all this, the political game continues. The court factions, now more divided than ever, use his health as a weapon. When Charles is ill, the pro-French faction whispers that his end is near, and that it is time to prepare for a new king. When he has a brief remission, the pro-Austrian faction celebrates, claiming that God has blessed their monarch with renewed life. He is a walking, breathing political barometer, and his every physical symptom sends shockwaves through the courts of Europe. It's a bit like being a weather vane that everyone looks at, not to see which way the wind is blowing, but to make a massive bet on whether the world is going to end. And every gust of wind, every little shudder of the vane, is met with a flurry of activity and intrigue. The pressure on Charles, both to live and to die, is immense, and you can see him, a fragile man caught in a storm of his own making, a storm of blood, politics, and a history of bad genes. The years of Charles's reign blur into a quiet, sad spiral. You're still there, a silent witness to a king's unravelling mind. The pressure to produce an heir, the brutal medical treatments, and the constant political manoeuvring have taken a heavy toll. He's a man in his 30s, but he has the body of a much older man and the mind of a child. His cognitive decline is now a glaring, undeniable fact. His speech, always a problem, becomes more slurred and less frequent. His grip on reality is tenuous at best, and he often seems to be living in a world of his own making, a world of shadows, whispers, and terrifying visions. A mainstream historical fact is that Charles II suffered from increasingly severe psychological and neurological issues as he aged. He was prone to fits of mania and profound, debilitating depression. One moment he would be filled with a childlike joy, only to descend into a deep, dark sadness the next. His court, once a bustling centre of power, now becomes a place of hushed tones and anxious glances. Courtiers and diplomats have to learn to navigate his moods, to speak simply and clearly, and to never ever challenge his bizarre perceptions. It's a bit like trying to have a serious conversation with a toddler who happens to be the most powerful person on the planet. His paranoia is particularly acute. He is convinced that he is surrounded by enemies who want to poison him. He refuses to eat or drink anything that hasn't been prepared and served by a small, trusted group of servants. He sees plots and conspiracies everywhere, from the food on his plate to the drapes in his room. He becomes obsessed with the idea that he has been bewitched and that his illnesses are the result of a sorcerer's curse. This belief is not a delusion he holds alone. His mother, the Queen Dowager Mariana, and the court are also convinced. They had seen his mental and physical decay as so profound that it could only be the work of a dark supernatural force. You can see him, a frightened king peering out from behind a tapestry, convinced that a demon is lurking in the shadows. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is a truly bizarre event that took place during this time. To find the source of the curse, the court brings in an exorcist who performs a series of rituals to communicate with the evil spirit. During one of these seances, Charles II is convinced that the spirit of his dead wife, Marie-Louise, is speaking to him from beyond the grave. He tells the court that she is warning him about a new plot against him and that the people trying to heal him are actually trying to harm him. Whether he genuinely believed this or if it was a hallucination is impossible to know, but the court took it seriously. It led to a series of purges and arrests, with courtiers being jailed and tortured based on the king's fragmented, terrifying visions. The kingdom is now not just being ruled by a mad king, it is being ruled by the ghosts and demons he believes he sees. Historians still argue whether his mental illness was a form of schizophrenia, a severe clinical depression, or something else entirely. The medical understanding of the time was so limited that we can only guess. But what we do know is that his mental state was a direct consequence of his genetic heritage and his isolated, traumatic life. The constant stress, the debilitating illnesses, and the pressure to produce an heir all compounded a genetic predisposition for mental decay. The man who was meant to be the head of a global empire was instead a prisoner in his own mind, a tragic figure lost in a fog of fear and confusion. The political consequences of his mental decline are immense. With the king unable to make coherent decisions, the power vacuum at the centre of the court widens. His mother Mariana attempts to reassert her regency, but she is challenged by a series of powerful, ambitious men who want to use the king for their own ends. The court is a constant whirlwind of plots and counterplots, with different factions vying for control over the king's decisions, however rare and irrational they might be. The French ambassador, in his letters to Louis XIV, describes the king as a puppet with no will of his own, a man whose every word is a reflection of whoever was last to speak to him. It's a sad, cruel picture. The Spanish Empire, once the most feared power in Europe, is now being governed by a man who is a ghost of a king. One of the lighter, and again, quite dark moments of this period is a story about the king's obsession with the royal crypt at El Escorial. He would often spend hours there, staring at the tombs of his ancestors. He was particularly obsessed with the coffins of the children who had died young, often weeping and talking to them as if they were still alive. He would even have his own coffin, which had been prepared for him years ago, brought out so he could touch it and talk to it. It was a macabre hobby that only served to deepen the court's fear and superstition about him. He was a king who was more at home with the dead than with the living, a man who saw his future not on the throne, but in a gilded box next to the long-dead children of his family. You can see him there now, a hunched, tragic figure, surrounded by the silent marble of his ancestors, a man who knows deep down that he is the last of his kind, a king whose only legacy will be the end of an era. As you continue to bear witness to the sad spectacle of Charles II's reign, the air in the royal Alcazar grows heavy with the stench of political decay. While the king struggles with his inner demons, a far more formidable threat looms beyond the Pyrenees. You see the glint of a more polished modern monarchy in the north, a kingdom built on ambition and efficiency. The French, under the iron fist of King Louis XIV, are a constant menacing shadow over Spain. A mainstream historical fact is that Louis XIV, often called the Sun King, saw Charles II's weakness as a direct and glorious opportunity to expand the power and territory of France. He was a master of diplomacy, a genius of propaganda, and a monarch with an almost insatiable appetite for power. Louis XIV was not just a king, he was an institution. He had transformed France into the most powerful nation in Europe, and he had done it through relentless warfare, shrewd diplomacy, and the creation of a cult of personality centred around himself. While Charles II was a physical and mental mess, a testament to a dynasty's failure, Louis XIV was a paragon of regal perfection, or at least that's how he was portrayed. He was handsome, confident, and a masterful showman. He was a living, breathing advertisement for the power of an absolute monarchy, and his gaze was fixed on Spain. The French king's claim to the Spanish throne was not a far-fetched fantasy. He was married to Charles II's half-sister, Maria Theresa. This was a key piece of the puzzle. When they married, Maria Theresa was forced to renounce her claims to the Spanish throne, but the massive dowry promised to her never fully materialised. Louis, a man who never forgot a slight, argued that since the dowry was never paid, the renunciation was invalid. This flimsy legal argument became the basis for a potential French claim to the throne, and he would use it to great effect. He didn't just want to take Spain, he wanted to own it, to put a member of his own family on the Spanish throne and unite the two great powers of Europe under the Bourbon banner. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is Louis XIV's psychological warfare. He didn't just plot and plan, he used his court to subtly mock and undermine the Spanish. He would host lavish balls and feasts at Versailles, where the conversation would inevitably turn to the pathetic state of the Spanish monarchy. The gossip was a political tool, a way of signalling to the rest of Europe that Spain was a corpse waiting to be picked apart. The French court painters and writers were encouraged to create a contrast between the brilliance and vitality of France and the gloom and decay of Spain. It was a masterful, if cruel, use of soft power, a way of convincing the world that France was the natural and inevitable heir to the Spanish Empire. It's a bit like a shark circling a wounded seal, not just waiting for the kill, but also making sure everyone else in the water knows it's the dominant predator. Within Spain, the French shadow created a deep divide. The court was split between those who believed that a French succession was inevitable, and those who would die fighting for a Habsburg one. The pro-French faction, a group of courtiers who saw their own fortunes tied to Louis XIV's ambitions, began to actively lobby for a French heir. They argued that France was the only power strong enough to save Spain from itself, to restore order, and to secure the empire's borders. The pro-Austrian faction, led by Queen Mariana and her allies, saw the French as a mortal enemy, and they fought tooth and nail to preserve the Habsburg line. They looked to the Austrian branch of the family, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, as their only hope. Historians still argue whether Charles II was a victim of his own circumstances or a casualty of Louis XIV's boundless ambition. Was his tragedy an internal one, a story of a dynasty that ate itself, or was it an external one, a tale of a weak nation being preyed upon by a strong one? The answer, as is often the case, is a mixture of both. Louis XIV's relentless pressure only served to highlight Charles's weakness, to deepen the internal divisions within Spain, and to make the succession crisis a continental problem. The Spanish court, already a mess of intrigue and paranoia, was now a playground for French spies and diplomats, each one trying to get close to the king, to influence his mind and to sway his decisions. The French ambassador in Madrid, a man named the Marquis de Villars, was a particularly skilled operator. He would write long, detailed letters to Louis XIV, describing Charles's every illness, every irrational outburst, and every new bizarre medical treatment. These letters were a goldmine of information, a running commentary on the slow-motion death of a king and a kingdom. He would describe the king's slurred speech, his vacant eyes, and the way he would wander the halls of the Alcazar, a tragic figure lost in his own palace. These reports only served to strengthen Louis XIV's resolve, and to convince him that the Spanish Empire was ripe for the taking. This section ends with a sense of rising dread. The clock is ticking. Charles is aging, his health is failing, and the greatest monarch in Europe is watching, waiting, and plotting. The peaceful union of two great powers, which the first marriage was supposed to secure, has failed. The stage is set for the second act of this tragedy, a new marriage, a new queen, and a renewed, desperate hope for a child. But you, my sleepy historian, know better. You know that this is not a story of hope. It's a story of a dynasty's final, dying gasp, and the shadow of France is only getting longer. The Spanish Empire, it seems, is not destined to die quietly in its sleep. It is destined to be torn apart by the very family it sought to hold close. The silence in the Alcazar after Marie-Louise's death is a fragile, deceptive thing. It's not a silence of peace, but a pause before the next, more desperate act. Charles is a grieving widower, but the weight of his royal bloodline and the need for a male heir outweigh any personal feelings. The court, led by the pro-Austrian faction and his mother, Queen Mariana, is already on the hunt for a new queen. They need a woman who can succeed where the French princess failed, a woman whose bloodline is pure and whose loyalties are to the Habsburgs. Their choice falls upon Maria Anna of Neuburg. A mainstream historical fact is that this second marriage was another desperate political gamble, an attempt to secure the Spanish succession for the Austrian Habsburgs and to stave off the looming threat of France. Maria Anna is a very different woman from Marie-Louise. She's a German princess, a daughter of the Elector Palatine, and crucially, a niece of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold III. She's a woman of ambition and a formidable political will, a sharp contrast to the gentle, melancholic Marie-Louise. She's also a woman who is, in the eyes of the court, a much better fit for the job. She is a Habsburg relative. She's known for her fertility. She came from a large family of 17 children, and her loyalties are unquestionable. This is not a love match. It's a business transaction, a marriage of desperate necessity. A bit like bringing a champion racehorse to a barn full of old, sick ponies, hoping it will somehow revitalise the entire stable. The contrast between the two queens is immediate. While Marie-Louise arrived with a French flair and a sense of frivolity that clashed with the austere Spanish court, Maria Anna arrived as a serious, pious and intensely ambitious woman. She is a force of nature, a woman who is not just content to be a queen, but who wants to be a queen who rules. She's welcomed with a kind of desperate hope that you can almost feel vibrating in the air. The court, the clergy, the people of Spain, they are all looking at her, a beautiful, strong woman, and seeing the salvation of their kingdom. She is the chosen one, the woman who will give birth to the saviour prince. But the reality of her new husband is a shock. She had, of course, been told of his frail health and his deformities, but seeing him up close is a different story. The portraits, as you remember, are a beautiful lie. The man she marries is a sickly, childlike figure with a monstrous jaw and a vacant stare. His body is covered in sores from his endless illnesses, and he is prone to violent fits of rage. He is a man who seems to be actively dying, and yet she is expected to bear his children. The marriage is a difficult one from the start. Maria Anna is ambitious and strong-willed, and she clashes with Charles's simple, childlike nature. He is a king who is easily led, and she's a queen who wants to lead him. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the almost immediate and aggressive conflict between Maria Anna and the Queen Dowager, Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother. The two women, both ambitious Habsburgs, immediately clash for control over the king. Mariana had ruled Spain for a decade as regent and still wielded immense power. Maria Anna, as the new queen, wanted that power for herself. The court becomes a battleground, a cold war waged with whispers, backroom deals and religious piety. Maria Anna, knowing that her power is tied to her husband, begins to isolate him from his mother and her faction. She controls his schedule, his visitors, and his decisions, turning him into her own puppet, a role he has become tragically familiar with. It's a bit like two rival gangs fighting for control of a single, slightly confused mascot. Historians still argue whether Maria Anna's ambition was a good or bad thing for Spain. On the one hand, she brought a renewed sense of purpose and a clear pro-Austrian agenda to a court that was floundering. On the other hand, her ruthless ambition only deepened the political divisions and made the court a more vicious and unforgiving place. She was a woman who was determined to succeed, and she was willing to do whatever it took, from manipulating her husband to purging her rivals. She saw the end of the Habsburg line as not just a family tragedy, but a personal one, and she was going to fight tooth and nail to prevent it. The pressure on Maria Anna to get pregnant is immense, even more so than on Marie-Louise. The court, with its desperate hope, watches her every move. The doctors, emboldened by a new queen, begin a series of new bizarre treatments to aid her fertility. They prescribe special diets, they bring her sacred relics from churches, and they subject her to bizarre rituals. The constant scrutiny, the endless prayers, and the unceasing pressure to produce an heir create a suffocating atmosphere. She is a woman who has been put on a pedestal, but it's a pedestal that is slowly, inexorably collapsing beneath her. You can see her now, a beautiful, determined woman, her face a mask of piety and ambition. She's walking through the halls of the Alcazar, her eyes fixed on the future. a future where her son, a strong, healthy Habsburg, will sit on the throne of Spain. But the man she walks beside is a ghost, a sick king who is more and more a figment of his own imagination. The tragic irony of this second marriage is that it only serves to deepen the political crisis. The new queen brings new hope, but she also brings new division, new ambition, and a new, more ruthless fight for control. The Spanish Empire, it seems, is still on its way to a fiery demise, and this new queen is simply throwing more fuel on the flames. The Royal Alcazar is now a pressure cooker of intrigue and ambition, and at its centre is the formidable new queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg. You're still there, an invisible guest in the court, watching as her initial hope and determination give way to a frantic, desperate campaign to conceive. She arrived in Spain as a symbol of renewed hope, a promise of a future for the Habsburgs. But as the months and then years pass without a child, that hope slowly begins to curdle into a bitter, frantic desperation. A mainstream historical fact is that Maria Anna of Neuburg, despite her famed fertility, also failed to produce an heir, a failure that cemented the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and ignited a continent-wide war. The pressure on her is immense, a suffocating weight that she carries every single day. The court and the clergy, desperate for a prince, are now convinced that a miracle is needed. They no longer rely on simple prayers. They are actively seeking supernatural intervention. Maria Anna, a pious and devout woman, becomes a willing participant in this quest. She is desperate for a child, and she will try anything. You see her leading pilgrimages to the shrines of local saints, carrying relics, and praying for hours on end in the palace chapels. It's a sad and poignant image, a queen begging for a miracle that genetics has all but forbidden. It's a bit like trying to summon a thunderstorm by doing a rain dance in the Sahara. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the bizarre and almost comical attempts at conception that the court physicians and alchemists came up with. They concocted a series of strange potions and remedies, believing that they could either heal the king's fertility or improve the queen's. One popular remedy involved grinding up various animal organs and precious stones into a powder and having the queen drink it. Another involved a mixture of herbs and minerals that was believed to strengthen the womb. Maria Anna, in her desperation, willingly participated in these bizarre treatments, swallowing vile-tasting concoctions and enduring strange rituals, all in the desperate hope of becoming pregnant. She was a queen of a vast empire, yet she was reduced to being a guinea pig in a series of half-baked pre-scientific experiments. The public, for their part, also gets involved. The failure to produce an heir is seen not as a medical problem, but as a punishment from God. Sermons are delivered in churches across Spain, blaming the kingdom's decay on some unspecified sin. People begin to believe that the king is cursed, that the monarchy is cursed, and that the only way to lift the curse is through a miracle birth. The atmosphere is one of collective hysteria, a mass delusion that the fate of the nation rests on a single, impossible outcome. The whispers about witchcraft and curses that plague the king's youth now spread to the queen, with some suggesting that a sorcerer had made her barren as well. This period of intense desperation only serves to deepen the political divisions at court. Maria Anna, with her fervent pro-Austrian loyalties, is a lightning rod for the pro-French faction. They see her as a foreign interloper, a dangerous woman whose ambition could plunge Spain into a war to protect Austrian interests. They begin to spread rumours about her, painting her as a manipulative, avaricious woman who cares more about her own power than the fate of the kingdom. The court becomes a nest of spies and informers, with every word and action of the queen being reported back to her enemies. Historians still argue whether Maria Anna's desperation was genuine or a political performance. Was she truly a pious, desperate woman praying for a child, or was she playing a part using her public piety to gain more support for her faction? The answer, as with most things in life, is probably a bit of both. She was a woman who was in an impossible position, and she had to use every tool at her disposal to survive. Her piety and her desperation were both genuine emotions and powerful political weapons, and she used them to great effect. You can almost see her now, a figure of profound loneliness walking through the corridors of the Alcazar, her eyes filled with a mixture of prayer and political calculation. She knows that her position is precarious, that her power is tied to her ability to produce a son. She is a queen who is more and more a political symbol, a chess piece in a game that is being played across the continent. Her husband, Charles, for his part, is now a shadow of a man. His mental and physical state has deteriorated to such a point that he is little more than a living doll. He wanders the halls, his slurred speech and vacant eyes a constant source of anxiety and pity. He is a king who is now more a symbol of his own decay than of his own power. He is the last of his kind, a man whose body is a walking testament to a dynasty's fatal flaw. The tragedy of this section is that it's also painfully predictable. You know, from the start, that there will be no child. The desperation, the bizarre remedies, the prayers, the pilgrimages, they are all a form of slow-motion self-deception, a kingdom refusing to accept the inevitable. They are fighting against a force of nature, against the unchangeable rules of genetics, and they are losing. And you can see, in the faces of the courtiers, the priests and the queen herself, a dawning realization that the miracle they are praying for is never going to come. The clock is ticking, the French shadow is getting longer, and Spain is heading for a fall. You're standing in the midst of a silent war. The royal Alcazar has become a battlefield where the weapons are whispers, the ammunition is ambition, and the prize is the future of an empire. Charles II, the king you've been watching, is a ghost in his own palace, a man so incapacitated by illness and mental decay that he is little more than a living sceptre. The real power now lies in the hands of the warring factions that have torn the court apart. A mainstream historical fact is that in Charles II's final years, the Spanish court was completely split into two main factions. The pro-Austrian party, led by the Queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, and a powerful pro-French party, which had grown in influence and saw the inevitable transfer of power to the Bourbons. Maria Anna is a woman on a mission. She sees herself as the last bulwark against the French tide, a queen sent by God to save the Habsburgs. She's a master manipulator, a woman who is not afraid to use her piety and her political acumen to get what she wants. She surrounds herself with her German relatives and trusted courtiers, creating a tight-knit clique that controls access to the king. She is desperate to keep the Spanish throne in the Habsburg family, and she sees the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, as the rightful heir to the Spanish Empire. She fights with a ferocity that is born of both ambition and genuine conviction. You can almost feel her iron will, her cold determination, as she navigates the treacherous corridors of the Alcazar, her eyes always on the prize, but she is not unopposed. The pro-French faction, a group of powerful Spanish aristocrats and diplomats, sees the writing on the wall. They know that the Habsburg line is ending, and they believe that the only way to save Spain from being carved up by other European powers is to align themselves with the most powerful monarch in Europe, Louis XIV of France. They see the French as a more reliable and stable successor than the Austrians, who are far away and constantly at war with the Ottomans. Their leader is a Spanish cardinal, a man of immense power and influence, who begins a secret correspondence with the French court, paving the way for a Bourbon succession. It's a bit like watching a family inheritance being fought over, but the family is two massive empires, and the inheritance is a good chunk of the world. The king, tragically, is at the centre of this storm, a weather vane with no will of his own. He is swayed by whoever spoke to him last. Maria Anna would spend hours with him, impressing upon him the divine right of the Habsburgs and the dangers of a French succession. But the pro-French faction would find ways to get to him, to whisper in his ear about the glory of France and the strength of the Bourbons. He would sign a document one day in favour of the Austrians, and then, the next day, sign another one in favour of the French, utterly unaware of the contradictions. He is a king who is a puppet for both sides, a tragic figure being pulled in opposite directions by two powerful warring women, his wife and his mother, Queen Mariana, who has now been mostly marginalised by her daughter-in-law but still has her own influence. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the use of the king's cadaverous body as a political tool. As Charles's health deteriorated, the court factions would use his physical state as a form of propaganda. The pro-Austrian faction would claim that the king's sudden fevers and seizures were the result of French black magic, an attempt to hasten his death. The pro-French faction would counter that his illnesses were a sign of divine displeasure with the Habsburgs, and that a new, more vital line of kings was needed. They would use his slurred speech and his mental confusion as proof that he was unfit to rule, and that Spain needed a strong, decisive leader. It's a macabre and brutal form of politics, where a man's physical suffering is turned into a weapon in a war for his own empire. Historians still argue whether the pro-French faction's actions were treasonous or a pragmatic, necessary step to save Spain. Were they traitors who were selling their country to a foreign power? Or were they realists who saw the inevitable and wanted to secure the best possible outcome for their nation? The answer, as with most things, is a matter of perspective. From the Habsburg point of view, they were traitors. From a French point of view, they were wise men. From a Spanish point of view, they were men who were trying to navigate an impossible situation, trying to find a way to save their nation from a slow, agonizing death. The end of the story is now in sight. The king is fading fast. The court is a frenzy of activity, a whirlwind of spies, informers, and backroom deals. The Spanish Empire is on the brink of collapse, and the great powers of Europe are watching, their armies poised and ready. You can almost feel the tension, the collective holding of breath, as everyone waits for the end. Charles is no longer a man. He's a prize, a trophy to be won, and the people fighting over him are willing to do anything to get it. He is a king who has been stripped of his dignity, his power, and his very humanity. He is a living monument to a dynasty's failure, and his final act, the signing of his will be a tragic, final surrender. You see him now, a man in a black velvet suit, his face a mask of illness and confusion, a king with no kingdom, a man with no will, a man who is the end of his line. The final years of Charles II's reign are a tragic, slow-motion descent into oblivion. You are a silent observer in the royal Alcazar, a witness to the final act of a king who is slowly, inexorably, ceasing to exist. The man who once held the most powerful title in the world is now a prisoner in his own body, his mind a foggy, confused mess. His physical ailments, always a constant presence, are now overwhelming. He is riddled with sores and ulcers, he suffers from violent convulsions, and his body is a roadmap of a dynasty's fatal flaws. A mainstream historical fact is that in his final years, Charles II was completely incapacitated, unable to make decisions, and utterly dependent on the courtiers and family members who controlled him. He is a man of profound loneliness. His wife, Maria Anna, controls access to him, but she's a political figure first and a wife second. She sees him as a means to an end, a fragile bridge to a Habsburg succession. His mother, the Queen Dowager Mariana, who once held the power, is now marginalised, a ghost in the palace, a sad reminder of a power she once held. He is surrounded by people, but he is utterly alone. He is a king who is a prize, a living trophy to be won, and the people fighting over him are willing to do anything to get it. He is a man who is being manipulated by his wife, his family, and the foreign powers who all want a piece of his empire. It's a bit like being a priceless piece of art that a bunch of warring art dealers are trying to get their hands on, and the art can't even move or speak for itself. His mental state is now so fragile that he's prone to what we would now call dissociative episodes. He believes that he is being haunted, that the ghosts of his ancestors are coming to him in the night, whispering warnings and prophecies. He would often wander the halls of the Alcazar, talking to himself, his slurred speech a testament to his decay. He is a king who is more at home with the dead than with the living, a man who sees his future not on the throne, but in a gilded box next to the long-dead children of his family. His obsession with the royal crypt at El Escorial, which you'll remember from before, becomes a constant presence. He would have his own coffin brought to his chambers so he could touch it and talk to it, a macabre hobby that only served to deepen the court's fear and superstition about him. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the story of the holy oil incident. In his last years, Charles II became convinced that his physical and mental ailments were the result of a sorcerer's curse, and he agreed to a bizarre ritual to lift the curse. A team of priests was brought in, and they anointed him with holy oils, not just on his forehead and hands, but on every single part of his body, believing that the oils would drive out the evil spirits. The king, a man covered in sores and ulcers, was subjected to a full-body anointing that was likely more painful and humiliating than it was helpful. It's a sad and poignant example of a king so desperate for a cure that he would submit to any ritual, no matter how bizarre or undignified. Historians still argue whether Charles II's final years were a continuation of his mental illness or a descent into a form of dementia. Was his belief in ghosts and curses a symptom of a long-standing psychological issue, or was it a new form of cognitive decay? The answer, as with most things, is a matter of conjecture. But what we do know is that his mental state was a direct consequence of his genetic heritage and his isolated, traumatic life. The constant stress, the debilitating illnesses, and the pressure to produce an heir all compounded a genetic predisposition for mental decay. The man who was meant to be the head of a global empire was instead a prisoner in his own mind, a tragic figure lost in a fog of fear and confusion. The political gamesmanship that defines his reign only intensifies in these final years. Maria Anna and the pro-Austrian faction are in a desperate race against time. They know that his death is imminent, and they are doing everything they can to secure the succession for their candidate. They isolate him further from the pro-French faction, intercepting letters and vetting visitors. The French, for their part, are also playing their own game. They are waiting patiently, knowing that the king is a ticking time bomb. They have their own man on the inside, a powerful cardinal, who is working to secure a French succession. The king, tragically, is a pawn in a game he cannot even comprehend. You can see him now, a hunched, tragic figure, his face a mask of illness and confusion, a king with no kingdom, a man with no will, a man who is the end of his line. He is a ghost in his own palace, a living monument to a dynasty's failure. His final act, the signing of his will not be a moment of power, but a final tragic surrender. The Spanish Empire, once the most feared power in Europe, is now being governed by a man who is a ghost of a king. And you, my sleepy historian, are a witness to the final sad act of a king who was born to rule but was, from the moment of his birth, destined to die. The year is 1700. The air in the royal Alcazar is heavy with the scent of sickness and the quiet dread of an approaching end. Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, is in the final throes of his life. His body is a ruin, a tragic testament to a dynasty that consumed itself. He is bedridden, his mind a fragmented mess, his slurred speech a near unintelligible whisper. The king, once the most powerful man in Europe, is now a silent, suffering ghost in his own palace. The question that has haunted his entire life, the succession, is now a matter of hours, not years. Everyone, from the highest-ranking aristocrat to the lowliest servant, is holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. A mainstream historical fact is that in the weeks before his death, the Spanish court was in a state of high tension, with both the French and Austrian factions doing everything in their power to influence the king's final decision, the signing of his will. Charles is a man with no will of his own, and the battle for his last will is the final brutal act of his reign. The pro-Austrian faction, led by the Queen, Maria Anna, and her German allies, are in a state of panic. They know that Charles's death is imminent, and they are doing everything they can to get him to sign a will that names the Austrian Archduke Charles, a distant relative, as his heir. They control access to his room, they vet every visitor, and they whisper in his ear constantly about the divine right of the Habsburgs and the perfidy of the French. They are a force of relentless, desperate ambition, and they are willing to do anything to get what they want. But they are not alone. The pro-French faction, led by a powerful cardinal and a few key Spanish aristocrats, is also playing its own game. They know that the king is easily swayed, and they are using their own brand of cunning and deceit to get to him. They have a brilliant and audacious plan to get the Pope himself to weigh in on the succession. The Pope, a man who is terrified of the power of Louis XIV, is convinced to write a letter to Charles, urging him to name a French successor to the throne. The argument is a simple and compelling one. A French succession would keep the Spanish Empire intact and would prevent a catastrophic, continent-wide war. An Austrian succession, on the other hand, would surely lead to a conflict between the great powers. The Pope's letter is a masterpiece of political manoeuvring, a brilliant and cynical play on the king's piety and his fear of God. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the almost supernatural intervention of a dead man. The French cardinal, in his desperation, comes up with a truly bizarre plan. He commissions a group of priests to perform a séance. The priests, in a dark and dramatic ceremony, claim to have contacted the spirit of Charles's father, Philip IV. The spirit, they say, has a message for his son. A French succession is the will of God. This is an incredibly audacious move, a blatant and theatrical manipulation of a sick man's faith and his devotion to his father. Charles, a man who believes he is haunted, is terrified. He is now faced with a choice between the whispers of his ambitious wife and the divine will of his dead father. It's a bit like being a final exam taker, but one of the questions is a riddle from a ghost, and the other is a demand from a very angry teacher. Historians still argue whether Charles's final decision was his own, or a product of these intense, competing pressures. Was he, in his final moments of lucidity, able to make a choice, or was he a puppet in a macabre show? The answer, as is so often the case, is a tragic one. Charles, a man who had no will for his entire life, was not going to develop one in his final days. His final decision was a surrender, a final act of a man who was too weak and too confused to fight back. He was a king who was robbed of his dignity in life, and he was robbed of it again in death. The end is swift and brutal. The French cardinal, with the Pope's letter in hand, is granted a private audience with the king. He reads the letter, and he convinces Charles that a French succession is the only way to save his empire from being torn apart. Charles, a man who is terrified of God and of the prospect of a war, signs a new will, a document that names Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, as his sole heir. The act is done in secret, and a few weeks later, on November 1st, 1700, the last Spanish Habsburg dies. You watch as the news of his death spreads through the palace and then through the city. The bell tolls. The court goes into mourning. But in the midst of the grief, there is also a sense of frantic, desperate anticipation. The will is read, and the pro-Austrian faction is in a state of shock and disbelief. Maria Anna is furious, her face a mask of rage and betrayal. The pro-French faction is in a state of jubilation. They have won. The long, sad and tragic reign of Charles II is over, and the stage is set for a new, brutal chapter in European history. The king, who was a monster, is dead, but the monster he gave birth to, a war for his empire, is just beginning. The sad, lonely ghost of a king is finally at rest, but his legacy is about to tear the continent apart. The final, rasping breath of Charles II on November 1st, 1700, does not bring peace. Instead, it unleashes a torrent. You are a spectral witness to the moment a dynasty ends, and a global conflict begins. The news of the king's death spreads through the royal Alcazar like a shiver, a moment of profound, cold finality. The people of Madrid weep for their king, but the courtiers, the diplomats, and the powerful figures of Europe are already looking to the future. The will, the document that was signed in secret, is the key to everything. A mainstream historical fact is that the death of Charles II without a direct heir marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a royal line that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries, and the beginning of a new, tumultuous era. The will is read to the assembled court. The silence in the room is deafening, punctuated only by the furious whispers of the pro-Austrian faction. Maria Anna, the Queen, is a vision of fury and betrayal. The will is a public, humiliating defeat for her and her family. The document names Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, as the sole heir to the Spanish throne. The pro-French faction, led by the cardinal, is jubilant. They have won. They have gambled, and they have won the greatest prize in Europe. The rest of the world, however, is not so happy. The news of the will travels across Europe at a frantic pace. In Vienna, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, a man who saw himself as the rightful heir to the Spanish throne, is in a state of shock and disbelief. He is a Habsburg, after all, and the Spanish Empire, he believes, is a Habsburg inheritance. He begins to make preparations for war. In London, the English and the Dutch, who have been terrified of a French-Spanish superstate for decades, also begin to prepare for war. The idea of the vast Spanish Empire, with all its colonies and territories, falling into the hands of the most powerful and expansionist king in Europe is a nightmare scenario. A French-Spanish alliance would dominate the continent and would threaten the balance of power for generations. It's a bit like 2 high school jocks suddenly deciding they're going to team up and then trying to take over the world. Everyone else knows it's a terrible idea. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the almost immediate propaganda war that begins. The French, in a masterful use of public relations, portray Philip of Anjou as a benevolent, peace-loving monarch who is only interested in the well-being of the Spanish people. They frame his ascension not as a French conquest, but as a divine appointment, a way of preserving the Spanish Empire from being torn apart by the warring factions of the continent. The Austrians, for their part, portray Philip as a puppet of his ambitious grandfather, a child who is being used to fulfill Louis XIV's imperial ambitions. They frame the conflict not as a war for power, but as a righteous struggle to save the Spanish Empire from a foreign interloper. The battle for hearts and minds is as important as the battle for territory, and the death of the king is the starting gun. Historians still argue whether Charles II's will was a good thing for Spain. On the one hand, it prevented the country from being immediately carved up by the great powers of Europe. On the other hand, it led to a brutal decade-long war that would devastate the country and leave it in a state of economic and political ruin. Was the will an act of foresight, a pragmatic decision to save the nation from itself, or was it the final, tragic surrender of a confused and sick king? The answer, as is so often the case, is a mixture of both. The will was an act of surrender, but it was also, in its own way, an attempt to choose the lesser of two evils. The Austrians would have torn the empire apart to get to it, while the French at least promised to keep it whole. The new king, Philip of Anjou, arrives in Spain. He's a young, handsome and charismatic man, a far cry from the sickly, haunted ghost who just died. He is welcomed by the Spanish people, who are tired of war and intrigue and who see him as a symbol of renewed hope. But his arrival does not bring peace. The Austrian faction, now in open rebellion, raises an army. The English and the Dutch, along with a number of other European powers, form an alliance against France. The stage is set for the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal, decade-long conflict that would embroil the entire continent and would change the map of Europe forever. The tragic irony of this section is that the man who was so desperate to produce an heir, the man who was so terrified of a war would, in the end, be the one to give birth to a conflict that would last for over a decade and would cost millions of lives. The king who gave birth to a monster, the sad, tragic Charles II, is dead, but the monster, the war, is alive and well. You see the armies marching, the flags flying, and the cannons roaring. The ghost of the king is finally at rest, but his legacy is a continent in flames. His life was a slow-motion tragedy, but his death is a sudden, violent explosion. And you, my sleepy historian, are a witness to the aftermath of a king's sad, tragic reign. A reign that ended not with a whimper, but with a bang. The sad, sickly form of Charles II is now still, finally at peace. But the true horror of his life's end is not the war he left behind, but the legacy etched into his very bones. You're now a guest at a scene of macabre curiosity, a final, brutal investigation into the life of a king who was a biological anomaly. On November 2nd, 1700, the day after his death, a group of physicians, anatomists and court officials gather in a chamber of the royal Alcazar. Their mission is to perform an autopsy on the last Spanish Habsburg king. This is a mainstream historical fact. Charles II's autopsy was a highly anticipated event, a medical and political investigation into the physical condition of a king whose life had been defined by illness and genetic decay. The chamber is cold and dimly lit by a few flickering candles. The air is thick with the smell of death and the pungent odour of the herbs the doctors have brought with them. You watch as they approach the body, a huddle of sombre, black-robed men. Their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and morbid fascination. They have heard the rumours, they have seen the king's deformities in life, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. The autopsy is not just a medical procedure, it is a political event. The French and Austrian factions are still at war, and the autopsy is a way for both sides to gain leverage. The French, who are now in power, are hoping to prove that the king was a fragile, sickly man who was not fit to rule, thus justifying their succession. The Austrians, for their part, are hoping to find evidence of a foreign poison, a final desperate attempt to prove that the French had a hand in his death. But what the doctors find is far more disturbing than any poison or political plot. The doctors begin their work, and their findings are recorded in a medical report that is both a scientific document and a terrifying work of horror. They find that his body is a collection of organs that are either atrophied, malformed, or rotting. His heart is small, shriveled, and filled with blood so black it looks like tar. His lungs are in a state of decay, riddled with holes and tumours. His intestines are riddled with blockages, a testament to his lifelong struggles with digestion. His liver is abnormally large, and his kidneys are covered in large black stones. But the true horror lies in his skull. The quirk or fringe tidbit here is the specific details of his cranial deformity. The The doctors, in their report, note that his skull is abnormally large, a condition known as hydrocephalus. His brain is a grey, withered mess, and his head is filled with a large amount of cerebral fluid. They also note the severity of his jaw, the infamous Habsburg prognathism, which is so pronounced that his teeth cannot touch. His tongue, they report, is so large that it is almost impossible for him to speak. The doctors are in a state of professional shock. They have seen death before, but they have never seen a body so utterly consumed by decay. The king's body is a roadmap of a dynasty's fatal flaws, a walking, breathing testament to the horror of inbreeding. Historians still argue whether the autopsy report, which was a public document, was a fair and accurate assessment of his health, or if it was a political hit job. Was the French faction using the report to justify their succession by portraying the king as a subhuman monster, or was the report simply telling the brutal scientific truth? The answer is probably a mixture of both. The report was written in a medical, objective tone, but its conclusions were so damning and so horrific that they served as a form of powerful propaganda. The autopsy report was the final posthumous nail in the Habsburg coffin, a public and humiliating confirmation that their dynasty had ended because it had, in a very real and biological sense, eaten itself. The news of the autopsy report spreads across Europe like wildfire. The French, of course, use it to their advantage. They portray the king as a freak of nature, a monster who was not fit to rule, a man who was destined to die young, and whose tragic life was a testament to the dangers of a royal line that refused to mix with the rest of the world. The Austrians, for their part, are silent. They can't argue with the findings of the report, and they are left with nothing but their own pride and a bitter sense of loss. The ghost of the king, the one you watch suffer for his entire life, is now being used as a weapon in a war for his own empire. The final brutal irony of this section is that the king, who was so desperate to produce a child, a king who was so terrified of a war, would, in the end, be the one to give birth to a conflict that would last for over a decade and would cost millions of lives. The king who was called the Bewitched, a man who was terrified of a curse, was, in the end, cursed not by a sorcerer but by his own family. The monster he gave birth to, the war, is a legacy of his death, but the monster that gave birth to him, the Habsburg dynasty, is a legacy of his life. You see the doctors putting away their tools, their faces grim, and you know that the tragedy of this king's life is now over, but the tragedy of his death is just beginning. The final morbid dissection of Charles II's body is over, but the repercussions of his death are just beginning. You're now a spectator to a full-blown continental crisis, a whirlwind of diplomacy and military mobilization that will tear Europe apart. The will, the autopsy, the death of a dynasty, these are not just historical events, they are the catalyst for a war that will redraw the map of Europe. A mainstream historical fact is that Charles II's death, and the subsequent reading of his will, which named a French Bourbon as his heir, triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that lasted for over a decade and involved all the major European powers. The news of the will's contents, that a French prince would now sit on the Spanish throne, sends shockwaves across the continent. In Versailles, Louis XIV, the Sun King, is in a state of high jubilation. His grandson, Philip of Anjou, is now King of Spain. This is the culmination of decades of plotting and ambition. Louis XIV famously says, "The Pyrenees no longer exist," a triumphant declaration that the two great kingdoms of France and Spain are now, for all intents and purposes, one. This is a moment of immense pride for France, but it is a moment of profound dread for the rest of Europe. In Vienna, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I is apoplectic with rage. He had a claim to the Spanish throne through his own Habsburg bloodline, and he was convinced that the will was a forgery, a final act of French deceit. He refuses to recognise Philip of Anjou as King of Spain, and immediately begins to raise an army to enforce his claim. His son, the Archduke Charles, is declared the rightful heir to the Spanish throne. The stage is set for a war between two great dynasties, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, a war that will be fought over the corpse of an empire. In London, the English, along with their Dutch and German allies, are also terrified. The prospect of a French-Spanish superstate is a nightmare scenario. They see it as an existential threat, a violation of the balance of power that has been the cornerstone of European politics for a century. They form a grand alliance with the Austrians, and they declare war on France. The conflict is a global one, fought not just in Europe but also in the colonies of the Americas and Asia. The War for the Spanish Succession is a testament to the interconnectedness of the 18th century world, where a single death in Madrid could lead to a battle in the Caribbean. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the almost immediate propaganda war that begins in Spain itself. The country is not just a battlefield, it is a war of ideas. The new king, Philip, is a Frenchman, and his arrival is met with a mix of welcome and suspicion. The Spanish people, a proud and fiercely independent people, are not entirely comfortable with the idea of a foreign king. The pro-Austrian faction, now in open rebellion, uses this to its advantage. They portray Philip as a puppet of his grandfather, a man who is here to dismantle the Spanish Empire and absorb it into France. They paint the Austrians as the true saviours of Spain, the only people who can preserve its independence and its glory. It's a bit like a family business being taken over by a new boss, and the old family members are telling all the customers that the new guy is going to ruin everything. Historians still argue whether the War of Spanish Succession was a necessary conflict or a foolish one. On the one hand, the alliance of France and Spain was a genuine threat to the balance of power, and it is hard to imagine a world where the other European powers would have simply allowed it to happen. On the other hand, the war was a brutal and devastating conflict that cost millions of lives and left Europe in a state of economic and political ruin. Was it a war for power, or was it a war for pride? The answer, as is so often the case, is a mixture of both. The conflict was about power, but it was also a struggle between two great dynasties who both felt a sense of entitlement to the vast Spanish Empire. The war lasts for over a decade. It is a war of attrition, fought on multiple fronts. The French, despite their initial advantage, are eventually exhausted and defeated. The English, under the brilliant military leadership of the Duke of Marlborough, win a series of decisive victories. The Austrians, despite their initial setbacks, also hold their own. The war ends with a series of treaties, the most important of which is the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The treaty recognises Philip of Anjou as King of Spain, but with one crucial condition: the crowns of France and Spain can never be united. The Spanish Empire is also broken up, with parts of it going to the Austrians and the English. The ghost of Charles II is finally at rest, but his legacy is a continent in flames. His life was a slow-motion tragedy, but his death is a sudden, violent explosion. The War for the Spanish Succession is a testament to the fact that even in death, a king can still wield immense power. The man who was so terrified of a war would, in the end, be the one to cause it. A final, brutal, and tragic act of a king who was born to rule, but was destined to die. And you, my sleepy historian, are a witness to the final, sad act of a king who was born to rule, but was, from the moment of his birth, destined to die. The cannons fall silent. The dust of a decade-long war settles. The map of Europe has been redrawn, and the once mighty Spanish Empire has been irrevocably diminished. The ghost of Charles II is finally at rest, but his legacy, a tragic and bitter one, continues to haunt the halls of Spanish history. You're now a spectator to the final scene, a quiet contemplation of a king who was born a monarch and died a monster, a man whose life was a series of slow, agonising surrenders. A mainstream historical fact is that the reign of Charles II, though a period of immense political and economic decline for Spain, is most remembered for his personal tragedy and the devastating global war that followed his death. The people of Spain, for their part, have moved on. They have a new king, a new dynasty. The Bourbons, under Philip V, bring a new kind of efficiency and a new kind of modern governance to Spain. They are a powerful, centralised monarchy, a far cry from the chaotic and crumbling Habsburg court. The Spanish Empire, though smaller, is now more stable. The new king and his family, a vigorous and prolific bunch, produce children with a dizzying speed, a stark and brutal contrast to the barren, tortured years of Charles II. The ghost of the Habsburgs, with their monstrous jaws and their rotting bodies, is finally laid to rest, and a new, more vital dynasty takes its place. It's a bit like a dilapidated old house that everyone was too sentimental to tear down, finally being replaced by a modern, clean and functional building. But the memory of Charles II lingers. He is a ghost in the royal halls, a tragic figure, a king who was so pathetic, so helpless, that he became a symbol of a dynasty's fatal flaw. His nickname, El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, sticks with him, a testament to the belief that his condition was so profound that it could only have been the work of a dark supernatural force. The reality, as you know, is far more tragic and far more mundane. He was not a victim of a curse, but a victim of his own family, a man whose genetic inheritance was a time bomb that was ticking from the moment of his birth. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the strange and morbid tradition that followed his death. The new Bourbon dynasty, in a final symbolic act of dominance, commissioned a series of official portraits of Charles II, but with a slight and very cruel twist. They were painted to emphasise his deformities, to make his monstrous jaw and his vacant stare even more pronounced. They were a form of propaganda, a way of signalling to the world that the old dynasty was weak, sick and subhuman, and that the new Bourbon dynasty was a strong, vital and healthy one. It's a brutal and powerful form of historical revisionism, a final public humiliation of a man who was already a ghost. Historians still argue whether Charles II was a victim of his own circumstances, or a casualty of Louis XIV's boundless ambition. Was his tragedy an internal one, a story of a dynasty that ate itself, or was it an external one, a tale of a weak nation being preyed upon by a strong one? The answer, as is so often the case, is a mixture of both. He was a man who was destined to die young, but his death was also a political event that was seized upon by the great powers of Europe. He was a man who was a ghost in his own palace, but his legacy was a continent in flames. The sad, final irony of his life is that the king who was so desperate to produce a child, a king who was so terrified of a war, would, in the end, be the one to give birth to a conflict that would last for over a decade and would cost millions of lives. The king who gave birth to a monster, the sad, tragic Charles II, is dead, but the monster he gave birth to, a war for his empire, is a legacy that would haunt Spain and the rest of Europe for centuries to come. His life was a slow-motion tragedy, but his death was a sudden, violent explosion. And you, my sleepy historian, are a witness to the final sad act of a king who was born to rule but was, from the moment of his birth, destined to die. The sun is setting on this long, strange journey we've taken together. The story of Charles II is a sad one, a story of a dynasty that ate itself, of a king who was born old, and of an empire that died with him. But it is also a story that reminds us that history is not just a list of dates and facts, but a tapestry of human ambition, human frailty, and human tragedy. The halls of the Royal Alcazar are now silent. The echoes of a king's slurred speech and a queen's desperate prayers have faded away. The ghosts of the Habsburgs are finally at rest, but the lessons of their tragic reign linger, a quiet warning to all who believe that power is enough to conquer nature itself. It's time to let the images of this dark, tragic world fade away. Let the flickering candlelight of the Alcazar dim to black, and the sounds of courtly intrigue give way to the gentle hum of your own quiet space. The story is over, the king is dead, and the world has moved on. There is nothing left to see, nothing left to hear. The story of the king who gave birth to a monster is now complete, and the echoes of his tragic reign are finally fading. The image of the sickly child in his velvet clothes, the frightened man talking to his own coffin, the desolate queen in her gilded prison, they are all receding into the shadows. Let go of the heavy history we've carried tonight. Feel the tension in your shoulders melt away, the frown on your brow smooth out. The whispers of the court, the desperate prayers, the rumble of distant cannons, they are all gone. All that remains is the soft, comforting stillness of your own room. The world of royal curses and political betrayals is far away now. In its place, a sense of quiet and calm is settling in. The weight of the past has been lifted. The last candle in the Alcazar has been extinguished. The king is at rest, and so, now, are you. It is time to let your mind drift, to welcome the gentle pull of sleep. Sweet dreams.